Christopher Nolan is a good director. And not just a good director, no, he's a great director. There is such a small number of filmmakers with a track record and style as consistent and strong as his, and every single one of his films are at the very least good. So many elements of the films that we watch today have been influenced by him, and that goes without question. The Dark Knight is iconic, Inception is such a brilliant film and responsible for probably the most iconic piece of film music in the last 3 decades, etc, etc, etc. But now we have Tenet, and for some reason it has been the most divisive and polarizing of Nolan's films, and that's saying something, because even Nolan fanboys, people who will go out of their way to deify his films, think Tenet is just kind of meh. What's up with the physics? Why does the sound mixing suck? Why the should we care about anyone or anything that happens in this movie? Nah, dude, Tenet is freaking awesome and it has deep, nuanced characters, and the physics are actually kind of genius. And Tenet is complicated. There's no surprise there, and saying that is an understatement to say the least, but as far as films go in general, this is on a completely other level than anything else that's come out in recent time. But even that statement is recontextualized when we look and see that there hasn't really been other films that have come out in the past year. Never has a film had so much pressure on it. The film has single-handedly been tasked with carrying the weight of the theater industry on its back to remind people why we go to the cinema, to live within the visceral experience that is being immersed into one of Christopher Nolan's mind-bending worlds. We expected this to be so many things. Following off the wartime masterpiece that is Dunkirk, presupposed with the ideas expected from Inception, the narrative complexity of The Prestige, and the auteurist, unique elements from Memento, almost everybody that saw Tenet came out of the theater confused. What was the film even about? How did the science work? Plot holes? What was Christopher Nolan actually trying to say? I don't blame them. Between Mouthful Michael Caine and the sound mixing, I don't blame the people saying what the actual flip was that. Unfortunately, Nolan is stuck between a rock and a hard place, and ironically his dilemma is the very catalyst through which all of his films balance on. Time. Time, or more respectively Nolan and his fascination with it, has always been leagues ahead of the climate in which he is operating in. The Batman trilogy was monumental, and it's paving a way for cinematic storytelling in the classical sense to be seamlessly implemented into a superhero story, something that for so long has had the connotation of cartoonish, childish, and lacking any substance. Inception took the concept of the heist movie and integrated within it an exploration of the subconscious and its relationship to the decisions we make on the day-to-day. Who does that? No one does it like Nolan does it, so now in 2020, after the world has gone to Captain Brain Squeeze has a new movie, and I saw it 5 glorious times. Sure, that seems like a lot, but that's just the problem. Remember when we used to analyze films and literature again and again because the people making them were artists and this was their canvas, and there was so much more than money at stake. It's worthwhile to look at these true pieces of art because their value is legitimately not possible to ascertain in any meaningful sense after a single viewing. Tenet is a prime example of why single-viewing film criticism is not a reliable method of gauging films like this. It's no surprise that Nolan classifies his films as an experience. What does that mean though? Is it an experience in the sense that Scorsese classifies Marvel films, something akin to a roller coaster, or is it something more nuanced and dense? I would argue for the latter. And beyond that, Tenet is in my view Nolan not only at his best, but at his most unfiltered and raw. A prime example of the kind of films and filmmakers we should be aiming to create and sustain today. Okay, I hear this argument a lot, that part of the reason Tenet felt so cold was that there was no emotional connection that we could establish between us and the characters that actually lent itself to wanting to care about anything these people were doing. To that I say please watch this movie a second time. It felt remarkably slower and less intense. Your first viewing is pure adrenaline and sensory pleasure. Seeing it in IMAX floods your body with sound and visual stimuli to the point where every sense is engaged at some level. Combined with the high concept mechanics, your brain is trying to deconstruct the last scene at such a rate that when the emotional scenes come around, they seem rushed, careless, or poorly written. I think that's an unfortunate artifact of the way we've conditioned ourselves to watch films, and it's helpful to go into a Nolan film not expecting anything other than needing time to process whatever you're about to see. Let's start with the protagonist. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to call him John, but not because I think calling him the protagonist is a poor writing choice. This is a good segue, however, as to why calling himself the protagonist is actually, in the least, a good writing choice. Who is John? Not only is this a question we feel natural to ask, but it is a question that, within the film, John actively avoids answering. At the very least, he is a special ops operative for who, all intents and purposes, has died both in the eyes of the government and the public as well. One of the first lines we hear in the film is, "We live in a twilight world." The first half of a coded message to identify people, the second half being, "And there are no friends at dusk." If the quote didn't speak for itself already, it just means that in a scenario where the world is so divided and everything is a militaristic and bureaucratic nightmare, it's every man for himself. Aligning yourself with an identity enables some sense of vulnerability, a desire to share yourself, even a basic element in the least, with someone else is completely off the table. Well, what about Neil? We know his name, and there's no denying he shares that bit of himself. Well, the end of the film explains to us why he was okay with sharing himself with John. Neil and John had a long friendship in Neil's past, something to come in John's future. But even then, in an interview, Christopher Nolan stated at the least the name Neil for Robert Pattinson's character isn't necessarily his real name. But semantics aside, it is the principle of separating yourself from a human identity that becomes John's prime character motivation for the rest of the film. From the moment he wakes up on the boat after taking the cyanide pill, we see this in action. Victor gives him the exposition on how all of this was a test, but the first question John asks is if his team made it, to which he was given the answer no. Victor then goes on to say that the reason the test was passed was because of his selfless humanity, his willingness to die before giving up his team. It was for this reason that John was accepted into Tenet in the first place. After this, we have a series of transition scenes leading us to him meeting Neil for a brief but meaningful exchange, then to Priya, and through her we meet Sir Mouthful Crosby, who leads John to Kat, the practically estranged wife of Andrei Sator. At the dinner, we learn some crucial information about both Kat and John. First, that Kat is aware enough to see through John's billionaire disguise, and secondly, Sator's toxic hold over not just Kat but her son as well. She says that to her, her son is her whole life, all she fights for, all that matters to her, and having that freedom to leave is something she would do anything for. At this moment, I can't help but feel like John has had an emotional connection with Kat. He recognizes the pain of being chained to a life you didn't mean to choose, maybe not in an experiential sense, but certainly in an empathetic one. At this point, Sator's goons show up at the table and Kat leaves, disguising her emotions under the words, "I'd better get going before I care one way or the other," which realistically says, and is exemplified in the shots to follow, that she does care. And the conversation not only brought back memories and the reality of her pain, but also causes her pain in the sense that in her good heart and innocence, she didn't want another person getting involved in her husband's malicious business. As soon as she gets into the car, this is rubbed in because the driver won't leave until her husband gets what he wants, which in this case is her pain. Seeing someone else fall under the merciless power he claims to wield like a god. Unfortunately for Sator, John is able to combat the goons just fine. This scene as a whole can actually be used as a singular example of the pure bare-bones conflict of the entire film. At this point, all of the base characteristics of John's character have been in action. His selflessness, compassion, and willingness to fight for something beyond himself may be things that completely slip by us on our first watch through. But it's in deconstructing these layers that we gain a larger, more complex and nuanced understanding of his character in relation to both the physical and emotional conflict. His relationship with Kat is, in my opinion, one of the stronger aspects of the film's writing. It doesn't bend directly to the classical archetype of the hero who falls in love with the damsel in distress, because the very fundamental architecture of their interpersonal relationships make that an impossibility for John. By the end of the film, we understand that John wishes that is the relationship that he could have with Kat. The script goes out of its way to purposely make sure that his character can't have any romantic connection with her, because for all intents and purposes, He is dead. Living in what would only have to be a somewhat public romantic connection would put Kat in danger. The best that he can do for her is protect her from afar, and this is where posterity comes in. Posterity is John's only way to be the protector in that relationship both he and Kat wish they could have together. Robert Pattinson is an underrated actor, and his ability to embody just about any role is exemplified here with a performance that keeps the humanity of the film accessible when it feels like everything else around us is literally exploding. He feels the most normal out of any of the characters here, but it did feel off. He was oddly more open, more knowledgeable than John's character, but when recontextualized by the scene at the end when he reveals that the entire film was a temporal pincer for John, every prior action carries a much deeper weight to it. All the way back to the opening scene where he saved John in the opera, Neil was there. John might be the big picture protagonist, but Neil had the more vital role of clearing a path for John even at the expense of his own life. Okay, so now that we've gone over the characters and how they are much more than cold exposition robots, I wanted to explore something that I found quite interesting within Tenet that you don't really see in other action films, and when you do, it's cringe or just outright condescending. But in Tenet, the way that female empowerment is expressed is done in such a way that it shows the women's strength and competence without the expense of the opposite gender. She's an abused wife who is both legally and mentally chained to the toxic marriage. She can't just leave because her son is her only will to live. He is her one and only motivation, but it is a conscious choice that she makes to bear with the pain, and not only that, but her willingness to try and love someone who was unlovable overruled the hurt she had felt prior. On her and Sator's vacation in Vietnam, she genuinely tried to love her husband again, only to have it thrown in her face when Sator offered her freedom but at the expense of her being with her son. And to know that internally she considered it, even for a split second, was her greatest regret. So staying with Sator for her son was actually the better thing to do. Her freedom in her mind was worth less than the ability to be with her child despite being abused. But at the end of the film, when Inverted Kat confronts him on the boat, she has the context and security of the safety of her son, posterity, and can confront her abuser. This time, she has no more love for the loveless monster who made her life a living hell. She was no longer in despair, and the scar in her stomach from the inverted bullet, a constant reminder of that torture. Her killing Sator was the ultimate catharsis, total freedom, a choice rooted in righteous anger. Sator's hubris grew into a god complex with no repentance, his own greatest sin being the self-admitted bringing a son into a world he knew was ending. Kat's empowerment was freeing herself from a bondage to end a hell, not just for herself, but for the sake of someone else. It was a selfless act accomplished for the sake and saving of one other than herself. So what? After all of this is Tenet trying to say? It's easy to feel like the movie was a series of bombastic firefights interwoven with half-hearted attempts at humanizing a world with such larger-than-life stakes. But at the very end of the film, Robert Pattinson's monologue is more than enough to solidify the emotional core of the film. He says that in relationship to what we've experienced, what has happened, happened. That statement being an expression of faith in the mechanics of the world, not an excuse to do nothing. To not let your past define you or your present bring you down, but instead to be an ambassador for your future self. You never know where you'll be then, but you know where you are now. So build a world for your future self, not just for you, but also for the friends you don't even know you have yet. Christopher Nolan is an amazing director. It's so easy to get caught up in his visual spectacle that we forget the heart of his films. In his view, film is meant to be experienced, and in real life we usually can't see the forest for the trees until our perspective is broadened and our horizons shaped. But I'd rather a messy experience of a film with lots to chew on than a spoon-fed drama or rehashed superhero flick that leaves no room to think for yourself. Whether he was born 20 years too early or 20 years too late, I don't know. But what I do know is that even though the world maybe isn't ready for Tenet, and in a sphere of film criticism where genuinely awful films are ranked higher, Tenet is an important piece of cinema to remind us of the potential of the art form, even if parts of it fall through the cracks. Tenet is the culmination of who Nolan truly is as a director, who is given the opportunity to make his movie no strings attached. Creativity is at the heart of filmmaking, and Tenet is at the heart of Christopher Nolan. And in a culture so devoid of unique ideas, this film is worth supporting just for the sake of art itself.